You're watching Capitol Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Welcome back. We now turn to our Reporters Roundtable, and joining us this week is only one reporter, so a small roundtable today, but it's Brendan Moore, political reporter for Lee Enterprises. Thank you so much for joining us.
Always happy to be on, Cole.
So I brought you on to talk about a story you had this week. It was really interesting. You took a look back at a law that was passed 5 years ago that would require Illinois State Police to construct this database of all of the gun crimes in the state, and the information would be sourced from ISP's data as well as local police and county sheriffs as well. And it was meant to construct this entire report that lawmakers would then get on an annual basis. Your reporting found that hasn't happened in 4 years. Interesting story to realize that something passed that long ago really has had no effects. Can you tell me a little bit more about what are the reasons you found for this delay?
Right, so you really have to go back 5 years ago. This was kind of embedded in a larger bill that would require gun dealers to certify their federal license. And included in that was the Gun Trafficking Information Act, which basically said that the Illinois State Police has to compile data on gun crimes in the state, whether it's police reports or just the number of people that have been hurt by guns, where these guns came from, you name it. So they're supposed to put this report together every year for the General Assembly and the governor, and they're supposed to make all this data available on a dashboard on ISP's website so any person can go and look at that data. But what I found is that what ISP found actually in their own report was that they just haven't been able to do it. The word they used was unattainable because basically you have, as you know, a lot of different reporting systems across state and local law enforcement agencies. So there wasn't a lot of consistency in the data. ISP claims that they kind of exhausted all of their ability to find this data, especially at the local level, but that they have not been able to find a reliable way to do so. On top of that, they, up until this year, have not been able to get their own house in order across their different divisions. The Division of Criminal Investigations, which is a lot of your plainclothes detectives and people that work on a lot of these task forces, were reporting these crimes differently than the Division of Patrol, which are your state troopers that are kind of on the front lines. So they've been working to be more consistent with their own data. So they made progress there, but in terms of local reporting from local law enforcement agencies, there's been almost no progress on that, and that's obviously where a majority of gun crimes are reported. Is you go to your local sheriff or to your local police department, and ISP just doesn't have that data.
So that was, I wonder how you came across this gap in ISP, what they were doing, what they were supposed to be doing. Was it because you weren't seeing the annual reports that were supposed to be coming in? You know, it's 4 or 5 years later down the road that you shine a light on this, but how did you really realize there was a problem here?
So it was actually in the report that they are mandated, ISP is mandated to file with the legislature every year. So you can go to the Illinois General Assembly's website and they upload it, and it was the actual report that basically says, here is our report that we are mandated to do, and we are telling you that we have not been collecting all the mandated information that's required in this report because we don't have an ability to do so. And there are a lot of questions inherent in that. Why haven't more efforts been made? I got a response from the state police that basically said we may need a change in state law to require local law enforcement agencies to comply and report this data to us. Well, why haven't efforts been made to do that? And why, after 5 years, why has it taken so long to come up with solutions? Some would argue that the state police aren't really all that interested in collecting a lot of this data. that it's very cumbersome. It's very you have to jump through a lot of bureaucratic hoops to get this information. But really, I think that the uh, the overarching issue here is that uh, lawmakers talk a lot about gun crime in this state. They talk a lot about finding solutions to gun crime and to gun violence. It's very hard to do that when you don't have a full picture, and we quite frankly haven't had a full picture because of these gaps in reporting. Um, and it begs the question of moving forward, uh, how effective are efforts going to be when you just don't have a full picture, especially with the new assault weapons ban, where the state police are going to be charged with collecting even more information. They're charged with leading a statewide effort to share information on gun crimes. Well, I mean, there's not a lot of information currently available.
I found it interesting. You talked with members of the legislature for the story, including Senate President Don Harmon, who, in one of his quotes for your story, just said, "I hope ISP tries harder," essentially was what he said. And I found that really interesting because ISP has had problems in the past that seem to be fixed by legislative action. But it didn't seem like the Senate president was that on board to say, you know what, we were the ones that maybe put too much on your plate. Let's try this again.
This is another example, and there are many examples, as you know, Cole, of the legislature enacting something and having this idea of we want to do something about a problem, pass a law, and then the implementation just kind of goes off the rails for one reason or another. I think you could argue that the legislature didn't provide enough tools to the state police, but also that the state police maybe weren't all that interested in doing this in the first place. So it just kind of one of those examples of legislative intent that wasn't followed through by the agency that the law would impact. Senate President Harmon was the chief sponsor of this legislation, and was very passionate. Has been a very passionate advocate for gun control on many occasions. But again, it goes to the whole question of: are we just trying to pass things that make us feel good, and to say we did something, but that don't actually have any actual impact, that don't have an effect because it can't be implemented, or it's just too cumbersome.
This also brings up another place where local governments, especially counties and the state, are going to have to get along in this whole process, and that has not been the case around firearm legislation, most recently with county sheriffs obviously outright opposing the state's assault weapons ban and all the drama that came with that. There are obviously sheriffs want to see gun crimes go down. That is not what I'm trying to bring about with this, but the question of more tracking, changing the way they track crimes, having to send this data to the state on a regular basis, that wouldn't just be cumbersome for the state police. That would put a lot on the plates of county and city police as well in this regard. And if there needs to be fixes for that program, if ISP is taking the real brunt of having to set this up right now, the state would need to consider changes that would also make it easier for those local governments. And ISP kind of lined out a potential way that could happen, but it has to do with really changing the way that local governments keep their records, correct?
Right. It's a matter of getting everybody on the same page. I mean, there are hundreds of law enforcement agencies across this state. Obviously, ISP is kind of the overarching statewide agency, but they all have different systems. And that inherently leads to data being inconsistent, and everybody having their own, reporting processes. And you can't say you have a good, consistent, clear picture unless you get everybody on the same page. However, it's looking like there may be an effort in the legislature to do the opposite of that, of mandating law enforcement all get on the same page. There are a few bills currently working through the legislature that would amend this act that requires them to report all this data and limit it to crimes that are investigated and reported to ISP. So basically, ISP would only be responsible for stuff that they investigate and not for all this other reporting of all what happens at the local level, which would be easier for ISP, of course. But again, it falls very short of the full comprehensive picture of gun violence data that was promised in this initial legislation.
All right, well, Brendan Moore, political reporter with Lee Enterprises, thank you so much for joining us. I highly encourage you guys to go check out Brendan's story. You can find it on the Panagraph website or any other Lee Enterprise Publications website. We'll be right back.